Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce this book launch of Felipe Roa. The book is called The Politics of Food Provisioning in Colombia, Agrarian Movements and Negotiations with the State. The book is being published by Erskine Routledge, and we are going to have a wonderful conversation around the book. Thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are. And please do not hesitate to use the Q&A and the chat so that we can have a very interactive roundtable type of book launch and really celebrate that marvelous achievement of Felipe. Felipe was my doctoral student at Audit from 2013 to 2019. He came to Oxford with a wealth of practical, on-the-ground experience in human development and humanitarian relief. It is therefore unsurprising that he became closely connected to OFI and the work of my colleague Sabina Alkhayer. I mention this because it's one of the reasons I feel that Felipe took quite a different route, his own personal original route through the doctoral research, and that he produced the kind of research he did, which is amazing, which has led Felipe to be chosen by OFI as their global policy network lead between October 2018 and May 2020. The thesis was called Rethinking Rural Development, Food and Agriculture in Colombia. And Felipe had a lot of thinking around how can you re-engage that question in Colombia, not so much on land conflict, but on a wider, more comprehensive picture. And that was really something quite amazing. That took a long time, and I'm sure that the discussion will go around this. Felipe's doctoral research won the prestigious national prize in the social sciences of the Alejandro Ángel Escobar Foundation in Colombia in 2019. In rewarding this prestigious prize, the judges made clear that Felipe had made a major contribution to renewing our understanding of the problem of food provisioning in Colombia. And I quote, "The research proposes a new look at the long-term agricultural trends and a new approach to analyzing the main demands from agrarian movements. It goes beyond describing a simple phenomenon. It proposes an innovative approach that explores the future of rural development and agriculture in Colombia from the perspective of food provisioning. This is thought-provoking research for the social sciences community, and it goes without saying, goes beyond Colombia as well." So what we are going to do today is we're going to have Felipe presenting his book, and then we are very fortunate to have with us two exceptionally well-qualified experts to discuss Felipe's book. We have Jenny Pearce, a leading specialist of peace building and the role of social movements in Latin America. She's been working over 40 years in international development on these topics. And in particular, she's done groundbreaking work in Guatemala and Colombia on conflict around land and on the role of the state and how social movements and NGOs can make a difference. And we have Professor Scoones, a pioneer in the livelihood approach to sustainable rural development, who has also done groundbreaking work on agrarian politics in Zimbabwe. And he is a leading figure of STEPS, the center whose approach on sustainability and resilience has inspired so many of us in the development studies community in this country and beyond. So, without ado, I'm going to invite Felipe to present his book.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your kind introduction. I really like to thank the Oxford Department of International Development and the Latin American Center at the University of Oxford, who've been the co-hosts of this event. It's absolutely fantastic to be here with you, Laura. You were my supervisor for all these years, and you provided very meaningful guidance throughout the whole process. So big thanks to you. To Jenny and Ian, absolutely an honor to have you both here. Both are academics who I admire and been inspired by a lot. So thank you very much. It is also great to have this event, of course, at my home institution, the Department of International Development with Latin American Center. So huge thanks also to Diego Sanchez and Cochea, and to David Doyle, the director of the Latin American Center. You mentioned my work at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and that is my extended family in Oxford. So special greetings to all my colleagues from OFI who I'm sure are watching. And just before I begin with the book, also I have to thank my family, because these type of projects are possible because there are loving family members around us. So thank you to Cindy, my parents, my brother, sister-in-law, nieces and nephew. So this book is dedicated to you.
No, please, Ian, as co-director of the STEP Center, I know you've organized many summer schools around issues of agriculture and food system, and I know that Felipe has much benefited from it as well. We are very much looking forward to your comments on how he has used ideas and putting together different frameworks in order to understand the complexities of the Colombian case.
Great. Well, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Felipe, for this opportunity. It's fantastic to be here launching this great book. And as you've explained, I mean, the book focuses on food provisioning in Colombia, but I think it offers some important insights into much wider development debates. And those are the ones that I'm going to concentrate on and leave the more Colombia-focused discussion to Jenny in a minute. Because food, I think, as you argue in the book, is a fantastic lens for seeing all sorts of debates come together. And I think that's why it was such a useful choice for your focus, because you say somewhere in the book, food is a human right, a biological need, a source of pleasure, a commodity. And as an analytical framework, a focus on food brings together visions of the future, meanings, relationships between actors, livelihoods, dynamics of capital accumulation, and links with climate change. So, I mean, you make the case very much that food is central to all of these things. And I think that's absolutely right. But I think what you do really nicely in the book, and Laura just hinted at this, is bring together some conceptual frameworks, two of which that have long interested me, as you know, to shed light on this in new ways through a fascinating case. And the two areas that come out very strongly in the book, and there are many others, are of course the livelihoods analysis at the center of it, and a complex systems analysis. And bringing those two together, I think, is a really important contribution. And these, as you know, are areas that we work on intensively at Sussex and in the STEP Center. So in terms of livelihoods analysis, asking how do people live, especially in rural areas, but that connection to towns that you mentioned also, and how agriculture and food fits into complex livelihoods is a really important debate. But how that is conditioned by wider patterns of political economy is often missed in some of the livelihoods analysis that we see in more instrumental forms. Asking these questions, following Henry Bernstein, who gets what and what do they do with it, is absolutely key to understand how food and those relationships within livelihoods affects patterns of accumulation and differentiation. I think there's a really interesting examples of that through the book. But more importantly, you connect that analysis to a wider understanding of food systems. But not any old food systems as understood as constructed socially and politically, and the product of negotiation and debate. In other words, how pathways to sustainability and development are negotiated, and how questions of directionality, which pathways go where, and distribution, who wins and who loses, are balanced out in agro-food systems. And I think this, informed, complex livelihood and systems analysis coming together in the book, in and around, as you've explained, the re-emergence of national agrarian movements in Colombia, particularly around the strikes that you've talked about from 2013, is a really important lens to understand how contested development narratives are debated, including centrally around food. But I think, this case is fascinating in of itself for the book, but I think those who want to read it and think about it more broadly, it resonates with a lot of wider debates about food systems going on globally at the moment. As you know, in September, we had the United Nations Food Systems Summit, where a politics of food systems, or a politics of food provisioning, as you call it, was almost completely absent. It was silenced by a very bland form of multi-stakeholderism and obviously dominated by a pattern of corporate capture. But the experience of Colombia shows that alternative dialogues at particular moments and particular political moments can emerge. Yes, they're contested. Yes, they're difficult. Yes, they're political, but they're necessary about thinking about what food futures really are. And that was really absent in the UN Food Systems Summit and in wider debates, I think, around food systems generally, which tend to be very technical in their orientation. What I really loved about the book was your ability to move between different levels, different spaces. You explained it very nicely in your summary. It's very much a multi-sided, multi-actor perspective on a complex subject. It's not just, a localized story about a village or a district, nor is it just a very sort of abstract policy analysis. It connects the two. And I think that's the real value of the book, because it incorporates voices from everyone from very high level government representatives through leaders from national agrarian movements to peasants and farmers from around the country. And of course, we see, as you've already said, a very familiar struggle between competing narratives and their associated pathways, between an articulation of an alternative agri-food system based on food sovereignty and localism from smallholders through to a sort of industrial export-import path articulated by the state. Very familiar in many, many settings. But what's so interesting in the book, as you explain it, is how the encounter between these two worlds happened. And that, through these discussions, new pathways were negotiated. And that's important to understand that that's possible. So this is not a classic story of the state and social movements in permanent opposition. You say at some point, they've been close allies in certain periods and fierce enemies at others. And as you showed in that picture, dialogue was at certain moments possible. So food systems don't just appear. They're not just objective realities out there as if they're planned by science or part of a sort of techno-managerial set of solutions, which again, the Food Systems Summit tended to focus on. They emerge out of negotiation and out of struggle. And I think that's really important to recognize, and what the UN Food Systems Summit organizers didn't, and which is why, in many people's views, it failed. So these big competing narratives that you identified, feeding the world, productivist vision, feeding the nation, ideas around food security, feeding the locality and the village, ideas about food sovereignty, are ones that are being debated everywhere, not just in Colombia. And they're throwing up these very tensions, this contested politics about food, whether that's around different narratives that the corporate sector have, or retail supermarkets, or the power of urban consumers. And I'm very glad you added that extra chapter into the book, because I think it gives that more rounded picture. And it's very, very relevant to everywhere. And you ask this big question towards the end of the book: what could be future pathways? This sort of future-orientated look out of this analysis, and I think that's, you know, a question that, as you know, in the STEP Centre we're always asking. You know, how do alternative pathways, new pathways to more just, more sustainable futures emerge? And it's very clear that it emerges out of a politics, a very contested politics. So you end the book, or somewhere towards the end, in the conclusion, with a need and a sort of call for us all to think about normatively about the politics of pathways and the politics of food provisioning. And you suggest 4 different things. The need to think about agricultural development and food using a complex systems perspective. Definitely agree with that. You need a grounded assessments in situated analyses of people in places, not just a broad policy analysis, but locating it in particular places. I definitely agree with that, because that's the basis of a livelihoods analysis as connected to policy. And the need to pay attention to the contested politics underlying such systems, that these systems are negotiated, they're political. And finally, that agri-food system pathways can be constructed to contribute to the multiple goals of poverty reduction, environmental sustainability, and social justice. Thinking about questions of which way, directionality, and distribution in the context of these negotiations and struggles, which I definitely agree with too. So I'm absolutely with you with your conclusions. I just think that what you've articulated for the case of Colombia has much wider resonance. And as we debate food systems, to get away from the, as it were, narrow technocratic visions that often dominate wider policy debate, this book provides a really important counter to that, and also more positively, not just a critique, but a set of suggestions for the way forward. So thank you. And I do encourage everyone to get hold of the book, buy it if you can, save up the money, get your library to buy it and enjoy it, because it's really, really well worth it. So well done.
Thank you, Jan. We will be encouraged to make different kinds of Christmas presents with you. Jenny, please, may I invite you now to come on board and to give your insights on the Colombian situation that you know so well as well, and you have known for so long. I mean, what are the hopeful, you know, pathways that the book is signaling, but are they as hopeful in your view?
Thank you very much. And I definitely echo Ian's last comments and urge you all to buy the book for all your family for Christmas. I was really delighted to be able to read and engage with this book. My field isn't food issues as such, so I was very interested in what Ian has just said. But I've been asked to speak more about the kind of impact on peace issues. But it's uncanny, but I actually had been thinking about this food issue in relationship to both Colombia and where I want to start my reflections, which is actually a different country, which is El Salvador. And it's because El Salvador also had a peace process, an accord signed in way back now in 1992. But because I spent a lot of time with peasants in struggle in El Salvador, and it made me think a lot, the book, about these broader issues around food, agriculture and peace. And just to give a little bit of background on why bring El Salvador into the conversation, first of all, and it's because there actually was no real agrarian agreement in the Salvadoran Peace Accord of 1992, but there was a land transfer program for ex-combatants. And over time, there was a lowering of the Gini coefficient for land from 0.81 to 0.75, and the percentage of landless rural households fell from 41% to 18% between 1971 and 2008. However, reintegration of ex-combatants did not tackle the structural crisis of the agrarian sector. It was a very short-term vision. And it's here that I think this book really comes in to help us to see the limitations of peace accords which do not take on board the broader aspects of political economy, and particularly the role of food within it. And 1992, you'll remember that actually the Salvadoran Peace Accord coincided with the rise of the neoliberal project. So the peasants I'd lived with during the war in El Salvador in the 80s, in the 90s, those peasants from Chalatenango in the country, a region of the country, they began to export their kids basically and gain remittances as the source of their survival. These poor rural people who'd been struggling for social justice and struggling for agriculture basically. And it's still the case in El Salvador that poor rural people have less access to agricultural land than those who are not poor. And small scale production, all these years after the peace accord, lacks access to technical assistance, to technology transfer, financing or marketing access. And another aspect that I thought had uncanny sort of resonances with the book and also with what's happening in Colombia is the issue of urbanization, because the Salvadorian economy shifted greatly from 1992. Rural people went into the city as well as going outside the country and migrating. And the economy shifted from an agricultural economy to a service and trade economy, highly integrated with other countries, both through migration, but also through remittances, investment and trade. In a sense, as Alex Segovia has written in a 2017 paper in which he looks at food security in El Salvador, there was an anti-agricultural bias in the Salvadoran Peace Accord. And that the prevailing economic model that accompanied the peace was actually aimed at real estate, commercial, industrial projects, not at agriculture. Ironically, this meant increased availability of food, right? Especially basic grains, maize, beans and rice, but all imported and subject to price rises, and increasing the food insecurity of the population amidst very adverse climatic conditions. El Salvador is now a net importer of agriculture and food products and spends 13% of its foreign currency earnings and almost 6% of its GDP in financing food imports. And I just wanted to just read the conclusion of Alex Segovia's paper because it seems so resonant with Colombia, even though this was so many years ago. So Alex writes, in the case of El Salvador, the peace process was highly successful at bringing the war to an end and bringing those who had taken up arms into the political process in the context of notable political reform. However, they categorically failed in their aim of reintegrating former combatants on both sides into productive activity, largely due to the short-term vision with which programs and projects to reintegrate such people into farming were designed. And because the peace process was not aligned with the economic reforms being carried out independently and in parallel with implementation of the peace commitments. In fact, instead of encouraging former combatants to reintegrate into the farming sector, these reforms had a negative impact on the sector's profitability and production, which caused the majority of the reintegration projects to fail. Now, I actually think that could have been written about Colombia today, but we'll continue and look at that now. We'll turn to Colombia. I think what I liked about this book is the fact that it points out so strongly that the agrarian question is more than land distribution, although that is also a fundamental issue, of course. And what I want to sort of bring in my sort of three comments really about the book, three things that sort of were highlighted by me, three themes. So the one is social agency, protest and dialogue. And Ian's already referred to those things. I want to sort of look at them in that Colombian context a bit. The second point is the urban, rural and the role of food. And the third is the political economy of peace and violence. So try and give just a couple of minutes to each of those. Not easy, but I'll do my best. So just looking at this issue of social agency, protest and dialogue, because I mean, these issues are very strong in the book. And I knew the peasant movement in El Salvador very, very well, and how the transformatory project it had at its heart. But I also learned about the capacity of illiterate, impoverished, exploited rural dwellers to think outside the box, to think differently. I actually went to observe something that was called Poder Popular Local, or their local popular power that they were organizing as the state was forced out of Chalatenango, and they began to administer their own areas saying to me, well, the middle class will and the illiterate will one day come back and run, but we've had some experience in running our own society. And then in Colombia, I first got to understand some of the rural struggles when I got to know Anouk in the 1980s, a movement that is mentioned quite a lot in the book, that emerged through decrees from the state under Carlos Lleras Restrepo, but which had its own process, including political divisions, and then was subject to extraordinary repression. But it was also a movement to articulate and defend a peasant economy. And I think here is a difference with El Salvador, which I wanted to sort of came across to me when I was reading the book. It is the way indigenous and Afro-Colombian voices in Colombia have injected an identity around land and food in a way that has given particular life to rural agency in that country. And also we've had, and I know the book deals with this towards the end, but it's nevertheless recognizes its importance, the way the women's movement in Colombia has also added a dimension to these struggles, which was not there in El Salvador, but in which women have talked about their relationship to the land more recently as well. And that I think has been incredibly important. I think talking about this issue of the dialogue and the alliances, right, which come out in the book, on the one hand, that between the peasants, the indigenous and the Afro-Colombian movements, right, along some interesting more political frameworks coming from global movements such as Via Campesina. And then the book talks about these possibilities of other alliances, particularly with the medium landowners, what Felipe calls the more entrepreneurial peasants, which have somewhat different interests to the others, but raises the question that Ian has also talked about of what kind of dialogues can really take place around food and land, and how can these impact on state and public policy. But I was also aware, reading the book, of the limits of alliances and dialogue. And one obvious limit is the clash with extractive approaches. And these were already apparent under President Santos, who was kind of engaging in these dialogues, but he was already also negotiating agro-industrial projects on public land. And this would clash with the redistributional responsibilities of the land redistribution unit. So that was one limit, that's this tension, this ongoing tension. And the other is intercultural tensions, which we can't ignore as well, which often weaken the alliances that some of the movements develop. My second point on the urban and the rural and the critical and central dimension of food led me to think about something in the book, which is the way the urban population of Colombia, through the agrarian strike, came to understand the issue of food provision so much better. And I thought this was so important in the potentiality for challenging the extractive mindset and its political economy, and particularly important in Colombia because of the plebiscite of 2016. Because when we've analysed the plebiscite, which we've been doing this year a lot because it's the 5 years anniversary, we note that it was the urban periphery of Colombia that voted against the peace accord. And I thought it was extremely interesting that food is something that can really connect the rural and the urban poor. And that maybe that's something to think about with the future of peace in Colombia, is to find these connections. Whereas what happened at the time of the peace accord is those urban peripheries voted against the accord, sometimes because they were impacted by displacement from rural areas, and their own economy was impacted negatively due to that. So I think there's a really interesting issue there. And then I think the whole book raises the big issue about the relationship and balance between rural and urban. I mean, Colombia is a 77.1% urban country. 24% live, according to 2018 figures that I found, in rural villages and are dispersed in rural areas. So this issue of how the balance between the rural and the urban and the issue of food also resonates, as it did with El Salvador and the way after the war people came in rapidly into the cities. This raises a lot of issues for me about the future of agriculture, the future of food, as well as the future of peace. And that leads me to my third and final sort of area, thematic area which emerged from the book, and that is this political economy of peace and violence. So it feels to me that the book reminds us of the centrality of a political economy lens, that without understanding it, peace is greatly weakened. If land is seen as a commodity, it makes it very difficult to pursue peace. The Reforma Rural Integral in Colombia, the integral rural reform, has 4 pillars. This was one of the first element of the peace accord that was signed, and in 2016. And these 4 pillars are a qualitative and quantitative leap in access and use of land, programs of development with a territorial focus, national plans in the rural world to allow for the radical reduction of rural poverty, and right to food. So there were some very good issues put on the table. And the fact there was a dialogue going on around the rural strikes and protests, I wonder if that did impact on that, the thinking behind that. So we had a lot of hope when that peace accord was signed and those issues were put on the agenda. However, we have to look in, this is the question that Laura asked me, well, to what extent do I feel optimistic? And I have to say it's the rural accord that makes one question some of the issues around what is possible through dialogue and how violence comes in. Now we know that the land distribution problem in Colombia it's the most unequal probably in the world. Gini index of 0.8889. The average in Latin America is 0.79. And what we've seen is a highly inadequate progress in the regulation of rural property, land titling, and very little attention to the social and ecological function of land. Land ownership highly correlated with land use, and the possibility of putting food provision and the social ecological importance of land at the center of the process was one of the great hopes, I think, and Felipe's book has really shown and argued why it has to be central. However, Colombia's agrarian economy is not geared to either of these, right? Either to food provision at the center or to the social ecological importance of land. And nor has the land distribution issue been dealt with to anything like the extent it needs to really establish a socially just rurality. We've had real weaknesses in the implementation of the integral rural reform, lack of funding. The present government has really had little interest in promoting it. But more than this, because I can't go into all the details on that, I think just the general fact that mining, agro-industry and cattle ranching continue to dominate is something we have to kind of confront if we're going to start to think what possibilities are there of a different form of rural economy. When I was thinking about cattle ranching, I noticed that there isn't a lot in the book on cattle ranching, although it's one of the areas of land that is particularly unproductive. But I also thought, well, cattle ranching is also an identity. Cattle ranchers have a strong identity in Colombia. It's that identity that has led them to defend their land through violence, their funding of the paramilitary, etc. So it struck me, here's another limit to dialogue. Here's another limit. What happens with the cattle ranchers? It's still a major sector of the population that do not support the peace accord. And there's some issues there that I think need to be thought about. So there is really, I think, no clear political economy to the peace in Colombia, as neither was there in El Salvador. No way of rethinking the importance of food and food provision, a term which I think Felipe has given us, which he also helped me to understand the difference between food security and sovereignty, very important aspects of this book. So this brings me finally, my final points, to the political economy of violence, not just peace. And I felt that violence is missing in the book a bit, right? That's fine. I mean, I'm not a criticism because I think you can't deal with everything. But I feel food and violence, land and violence, it's difficult to escape. And then I'll just put in the issue of drugs and violence, because it's obviously a major part of the peace accord as well in Colombia. And I've been working quite a bit recently with a project at SOAS, which is on looking at drugs and disorder. Colombia is one of the case studies. And it's very clear that drugs is a form of development for the poor, the rural poor of Colombia. And then we have these ideas that, well, alternative development could be another option. But actually, what alternative development is on the cards as a political economy, as a new way of thinking the economy of Colombia, it is not on the agenda. Coca is very easy to transport. Infrastructure remains a major problem for the rural economy in Colombia. But the other issue is, of course, the cocoa economy is mired in violence, right? And this is the problem for cocoa growers. For them, they've been able to get education for their kids through growing coca. But they have to do that, they have to live in the midst of violence. So, and we cannot de-link the assassination of social leaders that has been such a horrendous part of the implementation of the Codex, right, away from the ongoing role of the drugs economy. So this makes me think the particular value of this book is to help us not to think alternative development to cocoa, but to rethink development. It feels to me that's what this book points the way to, rethinking development by putting food provision at the center of development. And if we were to do that, I would have a lot more hope for the peace in Colombia. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Jenny. So we are now left with so much food for thought, if I may say. But Felipe, would you like to just react before I open the floor? We are having questions coming in.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Ian and Jenny, for your comments. Both very insightful, and I really like the way in which you broaden the perspective of the book for what I actually portray the book. I think one of the things that Ian said that really resonated is when these clashes occur, dialogue can open and pathways can emerge. I think that's a very important element of the whole analysis. I remember high level public officials saying this has been an exercise of learning from and understanding rural communities. We can't provide answers to everything, but we are learning. And I thought it was very rich, and it was one of the insights from my interviews. And the last part of what Jenny mentions on the relations, the relation of this, the links with food and violence are very important. In many of these negotiation sessions, many of these leaders, the agenda, they had established agenda for each day of the negotiation, but it all got pushed back because the first point was their concern because social leaders were being assassinated, including many of the social leaders of these movements. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. And in looking at the future, I think it's also important to link that better with the drug trafficking part, the illegal economies, and rethinking also rural development in these areas. So no, thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for both your comments and insights.
Thank you, Felipe. So there is one question I picked up in the Q&A, which builds a little bit on what Jenny was saying, but was trying to, I suppose, ask it in a wider non-Colombian context is, when you think that politics is basically about alliances and negotiations, how trustworthy are these agreements? How do you think that, in other words, you can really create change, or is it just superficial, or do you really believe that progress has been made in these negotiations? I think we'll never get back to what they were in the 70s and the 80s. Or wherever. I'm not so sure about the best period of horrible Colombian history to take as the one you don't want to get back into.
No, that's a really important question, right? Was there meaningful engagement in this, or was it something to get out of the way and carry on with business as usual? I think it can be analyzed from both perspectives. On the one side, I think the opening up was a true one, and there was an important opening there from the government to listen to and to address. But at the same time, as I was saying, this public official from the Ministry of Agriculture was telling me, it was as if we had opened like a Pandora's box, right? So many accumulated demands from the rural communities had been there that not all of them could be addressed. But the fact that there was a face-to-face dialogue, and that the government actually acknowledged the other one, that was extremely important, because that gave them, a political place in the politics of the country. That was very important. But at the same time, many of these commitments, to support local agriculture, to support as maybe the prices of the agricultural inputs, that was a bit more complicated. It not always happened, and not all the commitments made by the government were met. And at the same time, the other thing that I find interesting is that a peace accord was negotiated and signed. And so the priority of the government became the implementing, at least of the Santos government, became implementing the peace accord. And so this sidelined a little bit these agrarian negotiations, because also, there was a rural reform, and this rural reform will also be have these rural communities, engaged with the implementation, and so there was a bit of a mix there, in the final part of the conversation. But if we see the recent protests that started back in November 2019, that were not only rural but national and with different actors, and then were very strong earlier this year as well. These groups, Cumbria Agraria and Dignidad Agropecuaria, are there. So they continue the struggle, and they continue to be there. It's a different government, it's a different time, but they continue to be there, and they continue to struggle.
Thank you so much, Felipe. We have another question from another young researcher saying, now that you have established this framework and you have given us like a blueprint of how we can research, the role of agri-food systems in these conflictual political settings, what else is there to research? Are there things that you would want, that you haven't been able to cover in your own research, and you think you could advise new researchers to pay more attention to, that you couldn't pay attention yourself in your own research?
Yeah, definitely. There's much more research to be done in the future. One of the first things that comes to mind is how these emergent agrarian movements, such as Cumbria Agraria and Dignidad Agropecuaria, how are these connected to other Latin American movements? Because for years we've known a lot about the Movimiento de Trabajadores Sin Tierra in Brazil. We've known about the indigenous movements in Bolivia, in Ecuador, about the Zapatistas in Mexico, but Colombia has been absent for years of these national agrarian movements who've been advocating for agrarian reform. And so what I find interesting is that at least these movements in Colombia, particularly Cumbria Agraria, are linked with La Vía Campesina. And so I would it will be really interesting to explore those links in terms of the global movements, but also movements for Latin America at large. So that's one of the things that will be fascinating to in the near future.
Right, Felipe, you'll see that there are a few more very specific questions, and I'm sure you can follow that up with the young researchers who've asked them to you in terms of the politicization of peasant leaders. But I have a question myself, which goes back to what Jenny was saying, which I think is such a very, very important topic. and I know that Gwen Bernier in particular is trying to work on that one, is when you know that the political violence is so directly linked to not just vested interest, but people who feel that it is their way of life, you know, a kind of populism, I suppose, like the people who support Trump in the United States, but this liberalism, this, I don't know how to call it, but this political, very, how can I say, very factionalist, very, that feels so, so sure of itself, maybe of its rights and its privileges, such as the cattle ranchers in Colombia. And I can certainly think of people very similar in Brazil, the ruralistas. And their way of life depend on commodities that must disappear actually from the global economy because of the damage that they are creating to the climate, etc., etc. How do you think you can engage actors like that are so well organized, so sure of themselves, and so violent in their sense of collective identity?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, and connecting with what Jenny was saying on the cattle ranchers and their identities, right? There are also identities around cocaleros and those producing coca. And yeah, the question will be where are the consensus, right? And how are these, you know, different views interfacing at the very local level? I think that's something I'd like to think more about. Perhaps I don't have an answer at this point, but definitely engaging with these more complex dialogues is a novel way of rethinking development as well.
Right, and Felipe, would you say something about whether any of your collaborators in this research who were peasant leaders, whether they have become more officially involved in formal politics, maybe running for elections?
Yeah, this is a really interesting part, because just following these agrarian strikes in 2013, many of the leaders from Dignidad Agropecuaria went on to become candidates for different parties, particularly left and center left, and they were running for governance, to be in the councils of the cities or of the departments. That was really interesting. And in fact, there's a very young movement created with the same word, which is dignidad, and I think this is really interesting how these, you know, they come from a mobilization, like social mobilization, to seek political representation, and it's happening across movements.
Great, thank you, Felipe. Well, I think it's time to kind of wrap up. I know a lot of questions are keeping coming, but please feel free to email Felipe, and hopefully there will be more, you know, book launches and more ways of engaging his ideas. And so keep connected with us and with Felipe. But I would like to invite Ian and Jenny to just add a few words before we leave. Ian, would you like to say something as we are closing the event?
Well, very briefly, I mean, I think Jenny raised really important questions about the limits of dialogue. I mean, we can invest a lot of hope in negotiation and dialogue, and, you know, recognizing the limits to dialogue is really important. What are the structural limits that constrain the ability for real conversations to happen? There is a bigger political economy there. But if we throw up our hands and just say we can't do anything, then we're stuck. And I think actually what the book offers is not only a realism about those limits, but also some of the hope that we can focus on. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's contested. Yes, it may fail. But if we don't have real conversations about the future of food, whether in Colombia or elsewhere, then these wider developmental questions are not going to, not going to be resolved. So I would want to hold a little bit of hope in there. And I think this sort of notion of, what are the foci of debate that can help open up a debate? What are the alliances that can form around that become quite interesting? And I think it's right that rather than land, which is always, contentious, not surprisingly, but around food, different alliances can emerge. I mean, we talked about the rural and urban, for example. Consumers and producers have a common cause sometimes, and it can be important alliances to work with. And there are other alliances more focused on identities, marginalized groups around the country, whether of African origin or women's groups or whatever, can become the basis for opening up dialogue. So while we have to understand the limits to dialogue and not just be, sort of foolishly optimistic and naively optimistic, let's also think about the opportunities of opening up this space and, using the lessons learned in Colombia to see what political moments where there is a conflict and a struggle going on that can provide that moment, because those moments come rarely. And for a progressive move on land and agrarian questions, we have to capture those moments, because the wider political forces, which has have been discussed, are extractivist, productivist, and very often violent, can quickly become dominant again. So we have to seek those spaces, open them up, and move in. And I think there's some important lessons in there, without being simply naive about it.
Thank you, Ian. Jenny, would you like to offer some concluding remarks? You're muted.
Oh, yes, and also some hopeful ones as well, because the difference between El Salvador in 1992 and Colombia 2016 till today is in El Salvador, my campesino friends in Chalatenango, incredible dedication to a struggle to think politically outside the box, to defend their land and agriculture, but they didn't have these intellectual tools that I think are clear in Felipe's book, and which have developed through these various agrarian struggles, right? That wasn't on the table at that time. And I think it has been immensely important that those ideas are now being put on the table, are being part of these processes. We can't underestimate that. Now there's a framework, right, to talk about food, to talk about it in a new way. And that is vital. And then the second thing, hopeful thing to me, is the fact that the protests at that time in 2013, and then the recent protests last year, I mean, although there was some violence on the fringes, these actually were not violent protests. They were efforts, I think, to put new ideas onto the agenda and to open up spaces for dialogue. And although I think the sort of political and economic system is still resistant in Colombia, as it is in El Salvador, I nevertheless think that it's immensely important that these social activism and social movements are coming with new ideas to put on the table in a non-violent way and offering a different pathway to what the meaning of development actually is.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, and I know that we could continue it, but we have to say goodbye to each other now, and hopefully we will be able to meet again, because this idea that we need a new way of thinking about development, especially rural development, is so central to everything that we all do, that we will certainly have more conversations. So thank you again. Let us thank Felipe. And goodbye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.